Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you're watching or listening to this, and welcome to this week's episode of the Non-Identity Podcast. Now, this week we're joined by a fantasy author and someone who has decided to live off-grid in Portugal. It's Shanaz. Hi, Shanaz. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Lee. Thanks for having me.
Before we get into everything, can you just explain to people who you are and where you grew up and stuff?
Sure. So I actually was born and raised in Switzerland. But my father is Iranian, my mother Bolivian. So I'm a total mix and mutt. I went to the international school and I've lived kind of left, right, and center. And for the past, I want to say 6 years, I've been living off-grid in rural Portugal. My background, I studied biology and I got an executive MBA in healthcare management, but I've actually worked a lot in communications and project management. And right now, one of the hats that I wear is that I work for the United Nations in disaster management from the communication side. So I do a lot of different things, keeps life interesting, and it all ties into sort of how I'm making my life out here sustainable.
You mean when you work for the UN with disaster communications? Is that after disasters happen?
Well, actually, yes, not just after, but the project actually focuses on working with businesses before disasters happen, so to prepare, and so that there's less of an impact if and when a disaster happens, but also in response to a disaster, and then in the recovery phase after a disaster. And my role within the team is the communications piece, so everything from articles, website management, social media, all that good stuff.
When you're preparing businesses, does that sort of count for structural preparation, or is that more of an impact on the actual business itself?
It's a mix. It depends a lot on the business and what is their risk profile depending on where they are geographically. A lot of times if I have to take sort of a general approach, it's talking to business to make sure that they have a contingency plan so that they've thought of sort of what are they at risk for. And how can they mitigate that? How can they take measures ahead of time? Whether it's having their data on the cloud, whether it's making sure that they have a backup generator ready. And the goal is to either have them stay operational despite a disaster or get back to being operational as soon as possible. Because usually when there's a crisis, if businesses shut down, there's a good chance that they'll never reopen. And in our experience, the local businesses are really essential to recovery. They're usually part of the first response, right? Because they're on the front lines, they're part of communities. And then they're really part of the recovery, because if they're not there, then communities tend to not do as well. There's a loss of jobs, loss of income. So it's really essential to have them be a part of that disaster management spectrum.
What sort of crisis or disaster have you had to deal with in the past? Is it earthquakes or generally everything? Or?
Yeah, so unfortunately, it doesn't look like we'll be out of a job anytime soon. In this past year, probably the biggest one that was the earthquakes in Syria and Turkey. And one of my colleagues who's based in Istanbul actually deployed to the earthquake areas, and she was the sort of the focal point for private sector coordination, right? Because businesses are going to be there anyway. And so one of the things we try to do is make sure that they're working not independently, but in coordination with the United Nations and the government and other key stakeholders, so that it's not always the same people that get the help, but it really is based on who is affected and who is really in need of support, who then gets the help that they need.
And is there sort of certain criteria that businesses have to meet to be able to get the support from the UN, or is it just a sort of worldwide approach to the same sort of things for businesses?
That's a very good question. So we typically work with business associations, so chambers of commerce or federations. So it's networks of businesses, and typically, we have set partners on the ground, right? So we have right now 16 partners in different countries or regions, and that's growing every year. So it's not so much that there's criteria for them to get our support. It's more that we're building that community out so that they can learn from each other, and so we can support them. So that the idea is to build relationships before a crisis happens, right? Because once a crisis hits, that is the worst time to be exchanging business cards and figuring out who to call. So we try to do all that ahead of time, and that way, if these business networks are ready and willing to learn and to engage, then we can help them. We can meet them wherever they're at and help them grow and improve what they're doing to support their members. So the reason we take that approach is because it's much more efficient than us working with individual businesses, right? It's just in terms of impact, the cascade effect is much greater.
That makes a lot of sense. And to be honest, like you don't really think of businesses and stuff when it comes to a disaster. And that line of work I didn't really know existed. So I think it's an amazing line of work and hats off to you guys. So well done.
Thank you.
Going back to you, so you had decided to make the move to Portugal. Why Portugal?
That's a good question. My husband and I both grew up in Europe. He's Belgian Dutch and grew up in Belgium. And we actually met in New York, but when we knew we were not staying in the US long term, and so we knew we wanted to come back to Europe, and we looked at a couple different places. We ended up visiting Portugal and Spain. We wanted somewhere where land was affordable, where it was sunny, people were friendly, and Portugal just blew us away when we visited. We just fell in love with the people, with the wine, with the sun, with the food. There really was the only challenge was the language because neither of us spoke Portuguese coming in. But we figured there were enough other boxes checked that it was worth making the effort. So we landed in the sort of the center of Portugal because we wanted to make sure we wanted to live closer to nature, so on a farm. And so the biggest factor was water, right? Everything else we could work around, but if there was no water, then that's a non-starter. So the central region of Portugal seemed like a good balance where we have seasons. Summers are really enjoyable, but we still get snow and rain in the rest in the winter, which is fine. It's good for the land. And so that's kind of that's the short answer of how we landed here.
And what was it about the culture of Portugal that firstly surprised you, but secondly you sort of fell in love with?
So what surprised me is I had no idea how much of an impact Portugal had had on the rest of the world over the years, historically speaking, right? The Portuguese are actually very humble. But for example, they introduced tea to England. There's a certain number of words in Japanese that come from Portuguese. They've really, in terms of I mean, their history is not perfect, but in terms of their explorer years, I think they were pretty good at exchanging things and having a positive impact, not only, but also on the cultures that they came across. And so I found that really pretty cool. And they don't brag about it. Like you almost never hear about it unless you are looking into it. But then on a more personal level, we just found them incredibly welcoming. When we first visited the land that we ended up buying, we went to a nearby cafe, and the woman there was overjoyed that we were even considering moving here. And it was heartwarming because they could just as easily be closed off to having foreigners move in as they could be welcoming. And we found that the grand majority were really happy to have us, and they probably think we're a little crazy and don't know exactly what we're doing, but they're happy to have us, and that's really that goes a long way.
No, that sounds brilliant because I think I've noticed the problem with the UK at the moment. I think because of everyone just seems busy in the UK, so there's not really a sense of community. You sort of like I remember being younger and knowing all my neighbours and stuff. I've lived in my area for 5 years and I don't know who lives next door to me. And I think that's because everyone's so busy in their own situations that they haven't got the time no more. But it sounds like I have an aunt that lives in Spain and she says the same sort of thing about community. And I think that makes you feel happy when you've got a sense of community around you. When you mentioned you live off grid, what does that actually mean, living off grid?
So it was not necessarily part of the plan. When we started looking at properties, we thought, okay, if we find the right property, we'll make it work, right? Whether there's a house already, whether we have to build a house, renovate, whatever it is. And the place that we found that we absolutely fell in love with it's not connected at all. So we're a 5-minute drive from 2 villages, but there's no electricity grid that comes to us. There's no water lines that come to us. Like like in that sense, we're off grid. So we have great Wi-Fi, which is actually essential because you can without that life would be a lot more complicated. But all our water is from springs and it's gravity fed throughout the property. And in terms of electricity, we rely completely on photovoltaic, so solar panels. So in that sense, we're off grid because we're not connected to the grids as you would be in like an urban or even in the villages, right? We're kind of on our own.
Obviously, not visited Portugal if you don't know how it works, but do you still have to pay taxes and stuff?
Absolutely. I mean, we do. We have a business that we've registered here, so we pay into Social Security. and we pay taxes. What it does mean is there's a small tax that we have to pay in terms of using spring water, and that's just how the system works. But we don't have any base costs in terms of, like, we don't have to pay rent. Obviously, we own the place. We don't have to pay for electricity. We don't have to pay for water in terms of, whether we use the amount of water that we use doesn't matter in the sense that we're not paying for it. Now, of course, we've had to pay for the installations to be able to have, when we arrived, there was nothing. We brought a what we call a shepherd's hut. So like it's a 12 square meter tiny house that got plopped onto the land. There was no running water. There was no electricity. I mean, my husband is a watchmaker, and he luckily is very good with his hands and very good at figuring out how to do things. I am more of the marketing and comms and computer person. But so he set everything up. And so in that sense, we've had to pay those fees, but it's not, it's a different setup, right?
Yeah, when you first moved in, because obviously it's a totally different way of living, because like you said, you had to set up all your plumbing system and your electricity and that. Did you sort of think to yourself, what am I let myself in for, and is this worth it?
Yes and no. It was really exciting. So between leaving New York and settling in rural Portugal, we actually traveled for a year, and we did a lot of volunteering on farms, because we thought it's quite easy to be living in a place like New York City and think, oh, I want to live on a farm. There's like a kind of in our case, it was a kind of this romantic notion, and we thought it might be nice to test that before we go all in. So in that sense, we had lived in, a couple different places over the year, and had, some of them were completely off grid, some of them, they were different formulas, but that helped us kind of get a sense of what we were going to potentially get ourselves into. And so when we got here, there were once or twice where we wondered what we were doing, but it was more because the administrative side of things, it's in Portuguese and it's not our mother tongue. So even if you're doing admin in your mother tongue, it's not always fun. But when you're doing it in a foreign language and in a culture that is not your own, it really sometimes is mind-boggling. But I would say more than thinking, what on earth are we doing? It was more this gratitude, because we don't take anything for granted. Right? Like, because when we arrived, I mean, there was no running water. So we would have to, we had a couple of points on the land that had water. We'd go and fill 5-liter bottles of water, and that would be our drinking water, the water to heat up, to wash with, etc. And then, eventually when my husband set up the actual running water, it was like magic to have water coming out of the tap, So it really, and now we're much more comfortable. We've renovated certain spaces. We have, we're warm, we're dry, we have a lot of amenities. It's still far from perfect, but it really, it just means that the things that we would just not even question living in a city, we've had to work for one way or the other. And so it just means that we're much more aware and appreciative of everything we have, and how easy things can be at some point once you've done the work and laid the foundations.
No, that's a very good point, though, actually, because I think, like you said, we take things for granted because we can go to the sink and the water's running, because we can switch the light on, the light bulb can't light. People don't appreciate how much work actually goes into it. So I think with what you've just explained, it sort of does show what you need to actually do. How did friends and family feel about what you decided to do? Were they supportive?
It really depends who. But I will say, just to add, I think other than not taking things for granted, it also reconnected us a lot to nature. Yeah. Right? In the sense that beyond not taking the water for granted, we're also very aware, like if there's a year where there's less rainfall, we know that might have an impact on how much water we can use for the vegetable garden, et cetera, et cetera. So, and in cities, you usually, I mean, when I lived in cities, I had no idea where the water came from. So it's really, that's a big shift. And so, and I think it's an important one, because I think one of the big issues of our time is that people are so disconnected from nature that we forget that we're a part of nature. In terms of family and friends, very mixed bag. Most people were in disbelief, like they couldn't quite grasp what we were doing. Some still can't. Others were excited because they were like, when can we come visit? That sounds like an amazing adventure. And, really, I think the whole spectrum. My father, when I told him our plan, he kind of looked really concerned, and he had two reactions. His first one, he was like, well, what are you going to do about your retirement plan? Was his first question. And his second one was to say, well, but you don't know anything about land management or farming. How are you going to do that? And I said, well, 10 years ago, I worked in public health for a long time. And I said, 10 years ago, I knew nothing about public health, and I learned and I worked at it. And, by the end of 10 years, I was doing pretty well. And I'm okay with that, right? It's actually wonderful to be learning and to be curious and to figure all that out. So I think there was, generally speaking, we're lucky enough that I think both from my husband's side and my side, people were supportive, even if they weren't really sure what we were doing or why. And then I will say that after COVID, a lot of people were like, oh, okay, actually, you have a point. Like it kind of, because so many people were going stir crazy in their apartments or were struggling because of their setup, suddenly, even though that wasn't, we're not, we're not conspiracy theorists. Like that's not, we really moved here because we wanted to be closer to nature. But I think the experience of COVID made a lot of people just appreciate the fact that maybe it's not as crazy as they thought it was initially.
So that's what I was sort of going to mention, but I think it's a shame now because when COVID happened, a lot of people really appreciate nature because, like you said, that was the let out and stuff. But I feel like since everything's been lifted, we're slowly going back into the technology world again, and we're forgetting about nature again. But I think people need to realise, and they did during a period of time, how much we still actually need nature because being told you weren't allowed to leave your house. So it's really hard for me because of my experience of COVID weren't much different because I worked in a special needs school, so they stayed open. So I went to work every day. I went to the supermarket every day. The only thing I couldn't do was cut my hair and go for a meal. But other than that, life was pretty normal until my wife got sick. And because that was during COVID time, when she had to go off in the ambulance and I wasn't allowed to go with her and I wasn't allowed to go and visit and stuff, that's when I but that was sort of in the second wave as well. So when I kept hearing about everyone after the first wave and saying how bad it was, I couldn't get my head around it because to me, not much had changed. Other than my kids stayed off at school, but I was still going to work every day. The buses were free, so it was even better in a way for people being able to work. And I couldn't understand it until, like I said, the hospital thing. But I did see a lot of posts about how much people appreciated nature. Now I don't see that much anymore. It's pretty sad, I think.
I agree. I think it felt like the whole planet kind of took a breath, right? And you saw these incredible photos of like penguins in cities and wildlife sort of reclaiming spaces, and people appreciated having people got dogs to be able to go for walks. I mean, it was really, I think that was one of the silver linings and the gifts that the pandemic sort of could have delivered. But I think you're right. I think it's very easy to snap back, right, and go back to old habits because in a way the system didn't change. So it's very hard, and this is applicable for anything. If you're trying to change your diet, but nothing else in your life is changing, then it's going to be really hard because all of the nudges push you back into the habits that you had before. So I still hope that some people, or that a growing number of people are getting more into nature and maintaining that interest in sort of hikes and picnics and just going outside, also for kids. But yeah, I'm not sure how much of an impact it actually had long term, unfortunately.
Yeah, because it's very hard. Because I'm 39, so when I was growing up, technology was starting to take off, but it still wasn't there. So we had the Nokias without. So smartphones didn't exist till I was sort of in my 20s and stuff like that. So I got to experience. We still was going out every day and stuff like that, but then we also would have a little game on snakes and the Nokias. Trying to tell that to my children, I've got a 16-year-old and a 12-year-old, trying to say that to them, it's like I'm a dinosaur. Like, what do we go? And it's so hard because like we're meeting through technology, so we're able to have this conversation. My son can talk to his friends and stuff like that, so I ain't got to worry about where he's going to be. But then on the other side, it's just through a headset or a computer. So they're not getting the social side. So it's a very catch-22. I'm so up and down with technology and how much harm it is actually doing.
Yeah, same. I mean, I can only be grateful that technology allows me to work remotely. And I still travel in to be with the team, et cetera. But it makes a huge difference, right? Because there are, in previous jobs, because it was physical, and I'd go into the office, even if you're working really hard, there's always like a coffee break here, a lunch there, and you get to know people differently. Now, because it's online, even if you try and you're like, how was your weekend? The odds are that you're diving straight into work pretty much, right? So you don't get that sort of the human side. It's much more, Yeah, it's just not as nice in terms of the connection. And I do not envy, I have to say, the I'm a few years older than you, but I don't envy the younger generations that that's all they know, right? I
Yeah,
think
no,
it's
exactly.
much easier to reach the burnout, and it's a shame because you really lose that. I mean, that's the beauty when you meet colleagues, and then over time you discover you become friends. Maybe it's unlikely friends even, and that kind of gets lost when it's all through tech. But tech is also amazing, right? It also
Yeah,
enables so many different, there's so many digital nomads now, and there's so many communities that are thriving that wouldn't without technology. So that's always the issue with technology. And I coming back to the nature issue, I think that's part of it too, right? A lot of people think that technology can solve some of the climate issues and I don't think it's that simple, because I think if we rely so much on technology, again, we lose that connection to nature, and that's priceless, really. It really is something that we should hold on to and fight for more than we are.
and I think a lot of people forget a simple thing as breathing. If it weren't for the trees and stuff, we wouldn't be able to do that. So I think
Yeah,
people just don't seem to realise how
I,
important nature, even like bees and stuff like that. If they weren't for them, the world wouldn't be able to cope how it does. So I think people
exactly.
need to get back in contact with nature. Moving on to your writing, so you've released a fantasy adult novel. What's the title of that, and why did you decide to write a book?
So it's a young adult fantasy called Flight of an Orphan Thief. And
Right.
growing up, when I was a teenager, I played Dungeons and Dragons with my older brother and his crew. And this is the backstory to one of my favorite characters. So you don't need to know anything about Dungeons and Dragons to appreciate the story. It's
I'll
in the
be
world of
honest, I
magic.
never played the game, but I did used to watch the cartoon.
I mean, it's really this first book. It's light fantasy, and I wrote it. I arrived when I arrived in Portugal. I had more downtime than usual. We were volunteering, and I discovered National Novel Writing Month, which is started out of the U.S., but it's global. And it's every month of November, and the challenge is to write 50,000 words in 30 days. And I came across it, and I thought, I'm a sucker for a challenge. And if I don't do that now, then there's no, it's a perfect time because I have a bit more time. I still have Wi-Fi, and so that's the story that kind of hooked me. I thought of all sorts of different ideas, and I've always had a vivid imagination. I've always loved reading, and I thought, why not? And this was a long time ago. This was in 2017. So I did a first draft, and then I just kind of let it be. Life took over, and then maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I thought I would like to actually put that book out. I think it would be interesting to do. And so I got an editor and I started working on it. Again, it's a side project. So it took a while, but I ultimately decided to self-publish it. So it came out a few weeks ago, and it was really fun. It's been a really good experience. I decided to self-publish just because traditional publishing has changed and indie publishing have changed so much that no matter how you approach it as an author, you end up having to do, I think, a lot of the marketing and a lot of the legwork. And so I thought, well, for me personally, rather than spend, I don't know how many years trying to find an agent and a publishing house, et cetera, I'd rather put that energy into learning how to do all this stuff and just putting it out myself. And so that's what I did. And it's a fascinating universe, right? The publishing world. I'm still feel like I'm only at the tip of the iceberg.
Sorry to
Um,
interrupt, because I've had a
yeah,
couple of authors on before. And I've never asked because a lot of people self-publish now. What is the actual process of being able to self-publish? Is it simple as you write something and then you get it out there, or what actually is? I've never asked anyone. I just hear, yeah, I'll
that,
self-publish this, and I'm like,
I
okay
mean,
then.
it can be as simple. I mean, so it really, yes. The easy answer is yes. It can be as simple as that. With Amazon now, they have like basically an author backend where you can literally go and like you could decide tomorrow to whatever. If you have a PDF on podcasting, you could go and you could decide to self-publish it, right? So in theory, it's really not that hard. Then it depends, like anything. Like, yeah, right? Like to do it is not that hard. To do it well takes a little bit more effort, right? Because a lot of people, especially now with AI, like a lot of people, a lot of independent indie authors, they don't have much of a budget, and so they end up doing their own covers, and they don't hire an editor, and so some of the self-published books that are out there have potential, but they're full of mistakes, and it comes across as not very professional. And others, honestly, you can't tell the difference, right? There's some phenomenal self-published authors out there. And so it really depends. I guess it's like podcasting, right? Anybody can pick it up and do it, but not everybody does it so well. So it really is that same kind of field. And I think that's part of why I enjoyed it so much, because I was like, well, I want something out that's good, right? So I want to hire an editor. And I'm lucky enough that I have a full-time job, so I can do that. But I also wanted to approach it in a way where I would be learning a little bit more with every book, right? So this first book, for example, I hired someone to do the interior design. I hired someone to do the cover. I had an editor. For the next book, I'll probably do the interior design myself, right? So that each time there's a book that comes out, you're sort of owning more of the process. But it's really a phenomenal community. I mean, there's so many books that come out every year. There's so many self-published as well as traditionally published that it's hard to make it through the noise. But the beauty of it is that anyone has the potential to do it.
And do you worry though, because going back to what we talked about technology, sort of reading has sort of gone by the wayside in a way, the same sort of, like, I remember people reading all the time when I was younger. People used to read books on buses for other people, and that doesn't seem to happen. The library was always a busy place. Do you worry the way technology's heading that reading and people being able to be authors is going to slowly decline?
I think, I don't know if I'm just being an optimist, but I don't think books are going away anytime soon. I know, I mean, a lot of people use, Kindle Unlimited or libraries like the app, right? So a lot of people use either Kindles or their phones to read. But if nothing else, like with my book, like the number of people that have reached out and said, when is a paperback available, or will there be a hardcover? It's still very much there. And now that I've been connecting with the author community, the number of authors that do special editions, that do like box sets, and it's really, so I think the love of books is really powerful. And I think technology is creating communities around that, and it is facilitating, some people who have trouble reading or don't have time to read will go to audiobooks. And that's obviously, that still counts, right? That's still, so I think at this point in time, the technology is just broadening the options. I don't think it's reducing readership at all. If anything, there's so many books that's a challenge, right? Is how do you pick, and how do you break through the noise? But I don't think books are going to go away anytime soon. And I know there's some controversy because with AI, I've heard of some books being written with AI, and then so there's a huge question of sort of, well, what does that mean? Then who's the author? Who owns the rights, etc. That kind of freaks me out. It's such a big question. I don't know how people are going to deal with that. But I think we have time to sort that out. And in the meantime,
I'm hoping with AI that because it's new, it's like having a new toy. So I think we're just mucking about with it. And then over time, I think we're going to get a bit bored of it and realise that human hands and human minds are obviously more intelligent. So we'll just leave it to the side, because it is great for some things. But like you said, because in the education field as a teacher, we've had training on recognising if homework's been wrote by AI. Because a student will find a quick way of just typing in the homework question and saying, yeah, I've done my assignment. So we've had to actually have training to recognise if it's student or AI.
Is it hard, or can you still tell the human component?
It can be, because some students are clever enough to tell it to write in their style. So obviously you can tell, like, when we were younger, we used to copy and paste from like Expedia and stuff like that. A teacher could tell straight away because it weren't our language. But kids are working out ways of telling the AI to write in the way they would write. So it's making it harder. But in a way, I still find out the kids are using their minds because they're having to think way around the system to get the AI to do the right thing. So it's they're still expanding their learning.
They're still learning something.
Yeah, exactly. It may not be the right thing, but at least they're still using their minds. So, are you planning on releasing a series of books based around the characters of Dungeons and Dragons?
So initially I set off to write this book as a standalone, but there's at least going to be a second book, possibly a third, in this same series with the same character. So there's a series there, and I do also have in the pipeline the idea of writing a memoir. I've started, but right now it's on the back burner, as you can imagine, because this shift that we did from sort of corporate life in a city to farm life is one I know that not that many people want to make that shift, but I think the sort of the formula or the process of thinking about what you want in your day-to-day life and designing your life so that it matches that I think that's something that a lot of people are grappling with, even pre-COVID, but post-COVID for sure. And I think that our experience can help people realize that it's possible, right? And part of that is that, I mean, yes, I'm lucky enough to work for the UN, and so that definitely helps. But I'm also a wedding celebrant. My husband, also is doing some work in real estate, and he's done some stuff here in terms of watchmaking. And that's part of our plan, right? Is to say, well, we don't want a single, eventually we'll do tourism, but we don't want a single income stream, because we want to be more resilient and have options no matter what is happening in the world. And I think, again, even if that's not the road that other people take, I think just knowing that these kinds of alternative lifestyles exist it can just shift things a little bit, right? I've had a lot of people just say, oh, I didn't even know that was an option. And it's like, well, it wasn't, we just made it so, right? And so at some point I would love to do that as well, to just help people. If people are living in a city and working, 9 to 5 or 9 to 9 or whatever it is, and they're happy, then I think that's great. But I think a lot of people are just doing that because they think that's the only thing, and they're not really fulfilled. And that makes me really sad, because it's a beautiful world and there's so much to do. And so if I can even play a small part into inspiring people to find a slightly different way of doing things that makes them happier and more fulfilled, I would love to do that.
No, I think that's 100% needed. Like you said, I do think we just go along with our lives because that's sort of what we're told to do, and we're sort of conformed with what we have to pay because we need to live. So I think, like you said, people get by and they can say, yeah, they're happy, but they're not fulfilled. So I think you showing people that there is alternatives, and you be able to say, look, we tried it, it's okay with it. I think that's a brilliant message to send out. So I wish you good luck. If people want to get in contact with you and they've got more questions, where can they find you?
Instagram is a good place. I'm there. I have an author profile, which is at S.M.Radjy. I also have a farm profile, which is at the Cremouse.
We'll put them in the YouTube description below so people can get to them as quick as possible.
So that's probably the easiest, but we're easy to find. I have an author website and I have a farm website. Both of them have contact forms, and I'm always happy to connect with people on any of the very, very many topics that we've touched upon tonight.
Well, brilliant. We're going to have to wrap up soon, but I'd love for you to come back on and do a part 2, especially going to the farming side of things. But before we finish, I've got one last question that I ask every guest. If you could be remembered for one word and one word only, what would it be and why?
That's a really good question. So the word that comes to mind is enabling or catalyzing. I've been called an enabler before, and part of that, I think, is because in conversations with friends or colleagues, coming back to the last we were talking about, when people say, "Oh, I wish I could," I often say, "But why not?" And I love brainstorming, I love problem solving, and so I've helped a number of people just realize that what they want is not so far out of reach, right? It takes a little bit of work, but it's feasible. And so unrelatedly, a few people have called me an enabler, and I quite like that. So I think if I had to pick one word at this point in my life, that's what it would be. But hopefully on a future conversation, maybe there'll be another word that has come up since.
No, brilliant. Thank you so much for your time, and it was a real pleasure speaking with you. And like I said, anytime you want to come back on, you're more than welcome.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Lee.